Now, the moment the hospital director called my name, my stepmother threw a coffee mug straight at my face. She missed. But the sound of ceramic shattering against the podium microphone was loud enough that 200 people went completely silent. I was standing in my white coat about to receive the Resident of the Year award. My hands were already at my sides, the way you learn to hold yourself when you're trying not to shake in front of a room full of people who are watching you. That was 3 years ago, and I still think about it every time I button that coat in the morning. I grew up understanding that I was the family's investment plan. Not in a loving way. Not in the way parents sacrifice so their children can have better lives. I mean it in the way a landlord understands a rental property. Something to be maintained just enough, squeezed when necessary, and never ever allowed to forget who holds the deed. My stepmother came into our lives when I was 9. My father had remarried quickly after my mother passed, which I understood later was less about loneliness and more about needing someone to manage the house while he traveled for work. She was efficient at that. She kept the refrigerator stocked and the laundry done and made sure my half-brother, who was 4 years younger than me, had everything he needed for school. I had a roof and food. That was the arrangement. She made it clear, not loudly but consistently, the way water carves through rock, that I was tolerated. That the money spent on me was a debt I owed. That my mother's life insurance policy, which my father used to pay for our house, had come from tragedy, and I should be grateful every single day that anyone bothered with me at all. By the time I was 13, I had started doing the grocery runs, the pharmacy pickups, the driving. Before I even had a license, she'd have me move the car from the driveway to the street on trash days. By 16, I was filing her tax documents because she didn't understand the online portal and couldn't be bothered to learn. By 18, I had been accepted to a pre-med program at a state university 3 hours away, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me I was abandoning my family. My father nodded. He had a way of nodding at whatever she said that I used to think was agreement but eventually understood was absence. Like he had checked out from the inside years ago and left her in charge of everything. I went anyway. I worked 22 hours a week at a hospital cafeteria, qualified for every financial aid package I could find, and called home on Sundays. Sometimes my father picked up. More often, I'd get my stepmother asking when I was going to come home and help with my half-brother, who was struggling in school and needed tutoring, and wasn't I studying education or something like that? Medicine, I'd say. I'm studying medicine. A pause. And then? Well, that's very expensive, isn't it? Medical school happened across the country. I chose a program in Ohio because it was where I got the best scholarship and also, honestly, because it was far. The calls became less frequent. My stepmother began texting instead, which was worse, because texts don't have tone, and I found myself rereading them at 2 in the morning, trying to decide if your father's back is acting up again, was a guilt trip, or just information. It was always a guilt trip. I sent money when I could. Not a lot, I didn't have a lot, but enough to help with the electric bill once, my half-brother's soccer registration another time, a car repair my stepmother described as urgent and life-threatening, and which turned out to be a cracked side mirror. I told myself it was just what you do for family, that I was lucky to be able to help. I told myself that for a long time. My residency started at a teaching hospital in Western Pennsylvania. Internal medicine, which meant long hours, difficult cases, and the very specific kind of exhaustion where you're too tired to sleep properly but too wired to rest. I loved it in the way that people love things that are also slowly killing them, completely, and without much self-preservation. It was during my second year that things started shifting. There was an attending physician I worked under, Dr. Okafor. And I want to be careful here because she wasn't the only reason I started changing. But she was a significant one. She had a habit of stopping in the hallway after rounds and asking not, "How are your patients?" but, "How are you doing?" Not a small talk. As a real question, the kind that expected a real answer. I remember the first time she asked me, I started to say, "Fine," and she tilted her head maybe 2 degrees to the left and waited, and something in me just opened. I cried in a hospital hallway for about 45 seconds. Then I pulled myself together and told her I was struggling with the boundaries between what I owed my job and what I owed myself. She said, "You can't give from an empty cup. And I'm noticing your cup has been empty for a while." I thought about my stepmother's texts, about my half-brother, who was now 18 and had started calling me himself to ask for money, not asking so much as informing me of the amount he needed and the timeline by which he needed it. I thought about the last time I had visited home, Thanksgiving 2 years prior, and how I had driven 3 hours to arrive at a table where my stepmother had not made enough food, had not told me this, and had looked at me when I asked about dinner with an expression that said I should have known better than to assume I was expected. I drove back that same night, told myself it was because I was on call. It wasn't. The Resident of the Year award isn't the kind of thing you campaign for. You don't apply. A committee of attending physicians and hospital administrators reviews your case outcomes, your patient feedback scores, your teaching evaluations if you've done any, and your overall contribution to the department. I didn't know I was being considered. I found out 2 weeks before the ceremony, when the program director called me into his office and told me, in the way that people deliver good news, they're very confident about, that I should plan to attend the annual hospital recognition dinner. I didn't tell my stepmother. I didn't tell my half-brother. I called my father because he was still my father, and I told him I was receiving an award and that the ceremony was open to family if he wanted to attend. He said that sounded wonderful. He said he would talk to her about it. I should have known what I'll talk to her meant. After 35 years with this man, I should have known. But there is something in you, even when you know better, even when the evidence is overwhelming, that still extends the hand. That still thinks, maybe this time. They came, all three of them, my father, my stepmother, my half-brother, who was now in community college and had recently asked me to co-sign a car loan, which I had declined, which had led to a 2-week silence from him that he seemed to think was punishment. I saw them in the reception area before the dinner. My father hugged me. Genuinely, I think, he seemed proud in the uncertain way of a man who knows he has not done enough, but hopes the feeling counts for something. My half-brother was on his phone. My stepmother looked at my white coat and said, "You look tired." Not congratulations. Not I'm proud of you. You look tired. I smiled and told her the hours were long. I introduced them to a few colleagues. I tried to be generous with the version of myself that assumed the best. Dinner was fine. Speeches first, then dinner, then the awards. I sat at a table with 2 other residents and their families, and I watched my stepmother across the room rearranging the centerpiece flowers in a way that suggested she found them inadequate. My half-brother had graduated from his phone to a conversation with a nurse he'd apparently decided was worth his attention. My father ate his salmon and looked peaceful in the way people look when they've decided not to engage with anything happening around them. The program director stood at the podium and began the Resident of the Year remarks. I want to describe what that moment felt like because I don't think I've ever properly put it into words. When you spend years being told, not always loudly, but persistently, in the way my stepmother had perfected, that you are a burden, that your accomplishments are either obvious or inconvenient, that the space you take up is space that could be better used, you start to hold success very quietly inside yourself. You achieve things and you barely let yourself feel them. You put the award or the grade or the acceptance letter in a drawer and you move on because allowing yourself to feel proud feels dangerous, feels like something that could be taken away. Standing in that room, hearing my name, feeling 200 people turn to look at me, it cracked something open. That's when my stepmother stood up. She wasn't aiming for the podium. I understand that now. I think she was aiming for me. She had picked up her coffee cup, the ceramic one from the pre-dinner reception that she had apparently carried with her into the ballroom, and she threw it with the particular energy of someone who has been holding a very long grievance and has just decided that this, of all moments, is the appropriate venue. It hit the base of the podium microphone. The sound system made a horrible noise. Ceramic went across the stage, and she screamed. She didn't even finish college on her own. We paid for everything. She belongs to us. 200 people. Silence. I stood completely still. I know I did, because I remember making the decision to stay still. The same decision you make in a difficult patient conversation when everything in you wants to react, but you understand that stillness is the only thing that keeps the room from getting worse. Dr. Okafor was in the 3rd row. I saw her stand up. The hospital security team was there within 30 seconds. My stepmother was still talking. Something about ingratitude. Something about everything she had sacrificed. Something about my half-brother's car loan, which had apparently now become part of this, and my half-brother was trying to pull her toward the door, and my father was sitting with his hands folded on the table looking at nothing. The program director, a man who had delivered bad news to families in this building for 20 years and who had a stoniness about him that I deeply respected, stepped to the side of the podium and said, clearly, into the microphone, what you just witnessed is not a reflection of the person we are here to honor. Dr. Reeves has earned this recognition through work that speaks for itself, and it will continue to speak for itself long after this evening. The room applauded. Not politely. The kind of applause that is also an answer to something. I walked to the podium and accepted the award. My hands were steady, I don't know how. My stepmother was escorted out by security. My half-brother went with her. My father stayed for 45 minutes, then came to find me during the cocktail reception afterward. He stood in front of me holding a glass of water and he said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know she would do that." I believed him that he hadn't known specifically. I did not believe him that it was a surprise. I told him I needed some time. He nodded. That same nod and left. In the weeks after, I spoke with a lawyer about the incident. The hospital had security footage. My stepmother had, technically, thrown an object at a person in a public venue. I had options. What I chose to do with those options took me longer to decide than I expected, because what I wanted was not exactly revenge and not exactly justice. It was something harder to name. I wanted the truth of what had happened to exist somewhere that she could not edit or minimize or reframe. I filed a formal complaint with the hospital's legal team. They pursued it. My stepmother received a citation for disorderly conduct. She was asked to undergo a mandatory mediation session as part of the resolution, which she attended and from which I am told she emerged having described herself as the victim throughout. That was fine. I had stopped needing her to understand. The harder thing, and I want to be honest about this, was my father, because the question of what to do with a parent who is not the one who hurt you, but who stood by while you were hurt, who watched and nodded and said, "I'll talk to her for 20 years, that question doesn't have a clean answer. I spent a long time in therapy working through it. I still am. What I landed on was this: I love my father. I also cannot keep giving him access to the version of me that still hopes he will show up differently. Those two things can both be true. I call him on his birthday. I send him a card at Christmas. When he had a minor cardiac event last spring, I helped coordinate his care from 3 states away because I am his daughter, and I am a doctor, and that is who I am. But I do not attend family dinners. I do not answer questions about my salary. I do not co-sign loans for my half-brother, who has since stopped speaking to me, which has turned out to be one of the quieter gifts of the last few years. The award sits on the bookshelf in my apartment above a small framed photo of me and my mother, taken when I was 6. In the photo, she's laughing at something outside the frame, and I am looking up at her face with the complete trust that only very small children have before the world teaches them to hedge their bets. I keep it there because I want to see it first thing when I wake up and last thing before I leave for the hospital. Not as a reminder to be sad, but as a reminder of where I came from, the real where. Not the house where I was tolerated. The love that existed before everything got complicated. Dr. Okafor told me once that healing doesn't mean the wound disappears. It means it stops running the show. I think about that on the hard days. The days when a patient's family dynamics remind me of my own and I have to breathe through the shift without letting it land on them. The days when I get a text from my stepmother. She still sends them, occasionally, usually when she needs something. And I read it and feel the old pull of guilt, the old question of whether I owe her something, whether I have been unkind, whether a better person would try harder. On those days, I look at the award, I look at my mother's face, and I go to work. Because the people in that hospital deserve a doctor who has learned the difference between giving from love and giving from fear. And teaching myself that difference, slowly, imperfectly, still ongoing, is the most important thing I have ever done. Family is not whoever shares your last name, it's who is standing in your corner when the ceramic hits the microphone and the room goes quiet, waiting to see who you are. I know who I am. I spent a lot of time thinking about cause and effect. It's part of what medicine trains you to do. Trace the symptom back to the source. Resist the temptation to treat only what's visible. And when I look honestly at everything that happened, at my stepmother in that ballroom with a ceramic mug in her hand, at my father folding his napkin quietly while the room fell silent, at my half-brother already moving toward the exit, I don't see a single moment that broke things. I see 20 years of smaller moments that made that one inevitable. That's the hard thing about how consequences actually work. They don't arrive dramatically or on schedule. They accumulate quietly in the background until one day the weight becomes visible all at once and everyone acts surprised. My stepmother had spent 2 decades telling me, in 100 small ways, that I was an obligation and not a person. She had never once been challenged on it, not by my father, not by circumstance, not by me. Because I kept returning, kept sending money, kept extending the kind of grace that she interpreted as confirmation that she was right about my place in the family. What looked like patience on my end looked like permission on hers. The mug was just the moment she ran out of subtlety. I think about Dr. Okafor a lot when I'm trying to explain this to myself. She didn't fix anything for me. She just asked real questions and waited for real answers, and in doing that, she modeled something I hadn't seen enough of. The idea that knowing yourself clearly is not self-indulgence. It is the foundation of every good decision you will ever make. I had been operating for years on a version of myself that was defined by other people's needs. I was the one who sent money, the one who showed up, the one who could be counted on. And none of that was wrong, exactly, but I had never once stopped to ask whether the counting was mutual or whether I was just running a debt that grew no matter how much I paid. Integrity is not a feeling, it's a practice. It means doing the right thing when it costs you something, yes. But it also means refusing to keep paying costs that were never yours to begin with. My stepmother's behavior at that ceremony was a moral failure, but so was every year I accepted her framing of who I was without question. I don't say that to be hard on myself. I say it because I think the more honest version of my story is not I was a victim who finally escaped, but I was a person who took a long time to learn what she actually deserved, and then had to build that understanding from scratch. Resilience isn't being unbreakable. It's being willing to look at what broke you, figure out why, and keep going anyway. Not because you've stopped feeling it, but because the feeling no longer gets to make your decisions. I am still learning that. I will probably be learning it for the rest of my life. But I show up to work every morning in that white coat, and I ask my patients the real questions, and I wait for the real answers. Because Dr. Okafor taught me that that kind of attention is a form of care. And I think the best thing I can do with everything I went through is make sure that when someone walks into my exam room feeling like an obligation, they walk out feeling like a person. That, more than any award on any bookshelf, is what I'm working toward.